perfect June afternoon, blooming roses, and a sudden, silent death. In the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, beauty often hides the darkest secrets. When wealthy Lavinia Pinkerton collapses lifeless among her prized roses, everyone assumes it's a tragic heart attack. Everyone except Miss Jane Marple. Where the police see natural causes, Miss Marple sees a poisoned cup, hidden motives, and a garden full of suspects. Who planted the seed of murder among the flowers? Chapter 1. The Roses of St. Mary. It was one of those perfect June afternoons that make the inhabitants of St. Mary Mead feel that England, after all, is still the most beautiful country in the world. The sun shone gently on the old stone walls of the cottages, the hollyhocks stood tall and proud along the lanes, and in the village garden, a small, lovingly tended patch of green behind the church, every rose seemed to be competing to display its finest bloom. Miss Jane Marple sat on her favorite bench beneath the old yew tree, her knitting needles clicking steadily. A soft cream shawl was growing under her fingers, though her bright blue eyes were not entirely fixed on her work. They had a habit of wandering, those eyes, observing, remembering, comparing small details that others often missed. "Such a lovely day," said Mrs. Dolly Bantry, and settling herself beside her friend with a contented sigh. "One almost forgets that the world can be troublesome." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Almost, my dear, but never quite." The two ladies were not alone in the garden. Several villagers had come out to enjoy the sunshine. Old Mr. Denham was trimming the hedge with meticulous care. Young Lettice Fortescue, home from her secretarial course in London, was reading a novel on the grass, her fair hair catching the light. And near the rose-bed, moving among the flowers with a possessive air of ownership, was Miss Lavinia Pinkerton. Miss Pinkerton was a tall, angular woman of 68, with iron-grey hair pulled back into a severe bun, and a voice that could cut through gossip like a knife through butter. She was the wealthiest unmarried lady in the village, the owner of Rose Cottage and several profitable properties in the neighbouring town. Her garden was her pride and joy, especially the hybrid tea roses that were the envy of every gardener within 10 miles. "Really, Mr. Denham," she called sharply, "do be careful with those shears near the Madame Butterfly. You nearly took a bud off yesterday." Mr. Denham muttered something under his breath and continued his work. Miss Marple watched the little scene with mild interest. She had known Lavinia Pinkerton for nearly 30 years, a difficult woman certainly, generous in her own way, yet quick to take offence and slower still to forgive. She had quarrelled with half the village at one time or another, including her own nephew, young Gerald Pinkerton, she who had visited last month and left in a hurry after a particularly loud disagreement about money. A sudden exclamation broke the peaceful afternoon. "Oh, Miss Pinkerton!" It was young Lettice Fortescue who had cried out. She had risen from the grass and was staring at the rose-bed with wide eyes. Miss Pinkerton had been bending over a particularly fine peace rose. Now she swayed slightly, one hand pressed to her chest, the other clutching at the thorny stem for support. A moment later she crumpled forward, her tall frame falling heavily among the flowers. For a few seconds no one moved. Then Mrs. Bantry was on her feet. "Good heavens, Lavinia!" Miss Marple's knitting dropped into her lap. She rose quickly, more quickly than one might expect of a lady of her years, and moved towards the rose-bed with surprising purpose. "Mr." Denham reached Miss Pinkerton first. He turned her over gently, his weathered face pale. "She's not breathing," he said hoarsely. "Lord help us. She's gone." Lettice Fortescue gave a small, choked sob and covered her mouth with her hands. By now other villagers had begun to gather, Dr. Haydock arriving at a run from his surgery across the green, the vicar's wife hurrying from the church porch, and several curious children peering through the railings. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the fallen woman, made a brief examination, and shook his head gravely. Heart failure, by the look of it, he said. She's been complaining of chest pains for weeks. I warned her only last month to slow down. He glanced at the scattered roses around her body. Poor soul. What a place to go, among her beloved flowers. Miss Marple stood a little apart, to her hands folded. Her eyes moved slowly over the scene. The way Miss Pinkerton's right hand still clutched a broken rose stem, the faint smear of soil on the hem of her lavender dress, the position of her feet, one shoe slightly twisted. Small things, unimportant to most people. Yet something about the picture felt not quite right. Mrs. Bantry came to stand beside her. Jane, how dreadful, in her own garden too. She was so proud of it. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. She was very proud. The doctor rose, brushing earth from his knees. I'll have to notify the police, of course, though I doubt there'll be any inquest. Natural causes, I should say. She was getting on, after all. 70 next birthday, put in Mrs. Bantry helpfully, though she never admitted it. Miss Marple said nothing. She was thinking of the expression on Lavinia Pinkerton's face in that last moment. Surprise, certainly, but something else as well. Something almost like recognition. As the afternoon light began to soften and the first shadows lengthened across the grass, the villagers slowly dispersed. Miss Pinkerton's body was carried with gentle respect into Rose Cottage. Dr. Haydock promised to return later with the necessary papers. Miss Marple did not go straight home. Instead, she walked slowly around the garden once more, pausing beside the rose bed. She bent down with some difficulty and picked up a small object that had been half hidden by a fallen petal. It was a tiny silver button, the kind that might come from a gentleman's cufflink or a lady's cardigan. She turned it over in her fingers, her expression thoughtful. Curious, she murmured to herself. Very curious indeed. That evening, as she sat by her own fireside with a cup of weak tea and a slice of seed cake, Miss Marple's mind was far from peaceful. Outside, the church clock struck 9. In the distance, she could hear the faint murmur of voices from the Blue Boar, where the evening's gossip would no doubt be flowing freely. Death had come to St. Mary Mead before, of course. But there was something about this particular death, among the roses in the bright sunlight with so many eyes watching, that troubled her. She picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking steadily in the quiet room. People think that gardens are peaceful places, she said aloud to her cat, who was curled on the hearthrug. But I have always found that where there are flowers, there are also roots. And roots, my dear, can be very tangled indeed. Miss Marple smiled a small, quiet smile. She had a feeling that the roots in this particular garden went deeper than anyone yet suspected. Chapter 2. Whispers Behind the Teacups. The news of Miss Lavinia Pinkerton's sudden death spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed that only village gossip can achieve. By breakfast time the next morning, every household had its own version of the tragedy. Some said it was her heart, others whispered about the family curse, though no one could quite remember what the curse was. And a few romantic souls suggested she had died of a broken heart after her quarrel with her nephew Gerald. Miss Marple, seated at her little breakfast table by the window, listened quietly as her faithful maid, Cherry Baker, brought in the toast and marmalade along with the latest tidings. "Terrible thing, isn't it, miss?" Cherry said, pouring the tea with a sympathetic cluck of her tongue. Poor Miss Pinkerton, falling right there among her roses like that. Mrs. Bantry's cook says she looked peaceful, but I don't know. Dying in the dirt doesn't sound peaceful to me. Miss Marple buttered her toast with care. "One never knows what the last moments are like, Cherry. Sometimes the body falls, but the mind is still quite busy." Cherry shivered dramatically. "Gives me the creeps, it does. And to think I saw her only yesterday morning, marching down the high street with that stiff back of hers, telling young Tommy Blake off for riding his bicycle on the pavement." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. She was always very particular about the pavement. After breakfast, Miss Marple put on her second-best hat, the one with the small bunch of violets, and walked the short distance to Rose Cottage. She carried with her a small bunch of sweet peas from her own garden, a gentle offering of sympathy. The door was opened by Miss Pinkerton's housekeeper, Mrs. Martha Higgs, a thin, anxious woman who had served her mistress faithfully for 15 years. Her eyes were red from crying. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's good of you to come. She was so fond of you in her way." Miss Marple patted the woman's arm kindly. "We all have our ways, Martha. May I see her?" The body had been laid out in the best bedroom upstairs. Miss Pinkerton looked strangely small and dignified in death, her iron-grey hair neatly arranged, her hands folded over a lace handkerchief. The faint scent of roses still clung to the air. Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment, her keen eyes taking in every detail, the slight discoloration on the fingertips, the way the lips were pressed together as if in surprise. She noticed a small bruise on the inside of the left wrist, barely visible. "Poor Lavinia," she murmured. "You always like things to be just so." Downstairs in the drawing-room, several visitors had already gathered. Mrs. Bantry was there, along with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, and young Lettice Fortescue, who looked pale and shaken. "I still can't believe it," Lettice was saying, twisting her handkerchief. She was scolding Mr. Denham about the roses one minute, and the next, she was gone. It happened so quickly. Mrs. Bantry nodded sympathetically. "Dr. Haydock says it was her heart, and he'd warned her many times." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Martha and sat down in a chintz-covered armchair. Had she seemed worried lately? She asked mildly. "More than usual, I mean." There was a small silence. Then Mrs. Price leaned forward. "Well, now that you mention it, she did seem rather preoccupied these past few weeks. She told me she was thinking of changing her will again, something about family responsibilities." Lettice flushed slightly. "She quarreled with Gerald last month. He wanted her to invest in some scheme of his, motor cars or aeroplanes, I think. She called it reckless nonsense." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Money does cause such unfortunate disagreements, doesn't it?" The conversation turned to the funeral arrangements. Miss Pinkerton had left strict instructions, a simple service at St. Mary's, and followed by burial in the churchyard near her parents. No flowers from the garden. She had always said cut flowers were a waste when they could bloom where they were planted. As the visitors began to leave, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. She found Martha Higgs in the kitchen, washing teacups with mechanical movements. "Martha, dear, you look quite worn out. Had Miss Pinkerton seemed unwell before yesterday?" The housekeeper hesitated, then lowered her voice. "She had pains in her chest, yes, but she was more upset about something else. 2 nights ago I heard her talking on the telephone. She sounded angry. Said something about not standing for it any longer, and I know what you've been doing." Then she slammed the receiver down. When I asked if everything was all right, she told me to mind my own business. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "Did she receive any visitors recently, apart from her nephew?" "Only Mr. Denham for the gardening, and young Lettice came once or twice to borrow books. Oh, and that artist fellow, Mr. Raymond West's friend who was painting the church. He came to ask if he could sketch the garden, but she sent him away rather sharply." Miss Marple filed the information away carefully. She thanked Martha and stepped out into the bright morning. Outside Rose Cottage, she met Dr. Haydock coming up the path. The old doctor looked tired, but gave her a warm smile. "Jane, I might have known you'd be here. Come to pay your respects?" "Among other things," Miss Marple replied. "Tell me, Arthur, are you quite satisfied it was a natural death?" Dr. Haydock raised his eyebrows. "As satisfied as one can be without a post-mortem. The symptoms were consistent with heart failure." "Why? Do you see something I don't?" Miss Marple smiled her sweet, deceptively vague smile. "One sees so many little things in a village, dear doctor. Sometimes they fit together in unexpected ways. "Did you notice the bruise on her wrist?" He frowned. "A small one. She might have caught it on the rose thorns when she fell." "Possibly," said Miss Marple. "Or possibly not." They walked together towards the garden gate. The roses were still blooming defiantly, their petals glowing in the sunlight. Miss Marple paused by the bed where Miss Pinkerton had fallen. "Such beautiful flowers," she said softly, "yet even roses have thorns. And sometimes, Arthur, the most dangerous thorns are the ones we don't see until it's too late." Doctor Haydock gave her a long, searching look. "You have that look in your eyes, Jane. The one that usually means trouble for someone." Miss Marple adjusted her hat. "I do hope not, but I cannot help feeling that poor Lavinia's death was not as simple as it appears. There are undercurrents here, old jealousies, perhaps, and secrets that have been hidden for years." She reached into her handbag and took out the tiny silver button she had found the previous day. "I found this near the rose bed. It doesn't belong to any of Miss Pinkerton's clothes, nor to Mr. Denham's gardening jacket." Dr. Haydock examined it briefly. "Could have been dropped by anyone." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "By anyone who was in the garden yesterday afternoon." As they parted at the gate, Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind busy with possibilities, and she passed the vicarage, where Mrs. Price was cutting lavender, and waved cheerfully. She stopped to speak to old Mrs. Lorimer, who was complaining about the price of butter. All the while, her thoughts kept returning to the garden, the fallen woman, and that small silver button. By the time she reached her own cottage, the church clock was striking 12. Miss Marple went inside, removed her hat, and sat down at her writing desk. She took out a fresh sheet of notepaper and began to make a list in her neat, old-fashioned handwriting. Suspects, motive, opportunity, and, most important of all, human nature. She smiled to herself, a small, determined smile. "People are so very interesting," she murmured, "especially when they think no one is watching." Outside, the roses in her own garden nodded in the breeze, as if agreeing with her. But in the village of St. Mary Mead, the whispers behind the teacups had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Nephew and the Will. The funeral of Miss Lavinia Pinkerton took place on a grey Thursday morning that seemed to match the mood of the village. The little church of St. Mary's was comfortably full. Villagers who had sometimes found the deceased lady difficult in life now felt genuine sorrow at her passing. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, dressed in sober black, her hands folded over her prayer book. She observed everything with her customary quiet attention. The service was simple and dignified, just as Miss Pinkerton would have wished. The vicar spoke kindly of her long service to the parish, her generosity to the Church Restoration Fund, and her devotion to her garden. When the coffin was carried out to the churchyard, and a light drizzle began to fall, as though even the sky was reluctant to say goodbye. Miss Marple lingered near the lych gate after most of the mourners had gone. She watched as Gerald Pinkerton, the late lady's only nephew, stood talking in low tones with the family solicitor, Mr. Petherick, who had come down from London for the occasion. Gerald was a tall, good-looking man of 35, with smooth dark hair and an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He had arrived in St. Mary Mead the evening before the funeral and was staying at the Blue Boar. Miss Marple had noticed that he seemed more irritated than grief-stricken. "Money," she murmured to herself. "It so often comes down to money." Mrs. Bantry joined her under the shelter of the lych gate. Poor Lavinia. At least she had a proper funeral. "I hear the will is to be read this afternoon at Rose Cottage. Everyone is wondering how much she left to Gerald." "Human nature is always curious about such things," Miss Marple replied mildly, "especially when the deceased has quarrelled with the heir shortly before dying." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You don't think—" "I think nothing yet, dear. I merely observe." That afternoon, a small group gathered in the drawing-room of Rose Cottage for the reading of the will. Miss Marple had been invited as a friend of the deceased, along with Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, the vicar, and of course Gerald Pinkerton and Mr. Petherick. The solicitor cleared his throat and began to read in his dry, precise voice. The early bequests were modest, small sums to Martha Higgs for her long service, donations to the church and the local hospital. Then came the main part. To my nephew, Gerald Arthur Pinkerton, Mr. Petherick read, I leave the sum of £5,000 and my late father's gold watch. The remainder of my estate, including Rose Cottage, my investments and all other property, I bequeath to the Royal Horticultural Society for the establishment of a rose garden in my name, on the condition that it be open to the public and maintained according to the standards I have set out in a separate memorandum. There was a stunned silence. Gerald Pinkerton's face darkened. That can't be right, he said sharply. She promised me the house. We discussed it only last month. Mr. Petherick adjusted his spectacles. The will is dated 3 weeks ago, Mr. Pinkerton. It supersedes all previous versions. Your aunt was quite clear in her instructions. Gerald rose abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the polished floor. This is ridiculous. She was angry with me, that's all. She would have changed it back. I know she would. Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was real anger in his voice, but also something like panic. She noticed that his right cuff was missing a button, the exact type and size of the small silver button she still carried in her handbag. Mrs. Bantry leaned towards her friend and whispered, He doesn't seem very heartbroken, does he? Grief takes many forms, Miss Marple replied softly. Some people show it later when they are alone. After the reading, Gerald cornered Mr. Petherick in the hallway, speaking in urgent tones. Miss Marple, pretending to examine a watercolor on the wall, moved a little closer. I want to contest it, Gerald was saying. She wasn't in her right mind. She'd been having those heart episodes. Anyone could see she wasn't herself. Mr. Petherick shook his head. I'm afraid you would have great difficulty, Mr. Pinkerton. Your aunt was perfectly lucid when she signed the document. 2 independent witnesses were present, Dr. Haydock and the vicar. Gerald's hands clenched at his sides. Then I'll find another way. This isn't fair. I'm her only family. Miss Marple stepped forward quietly. Forgive me for interrupting, but family ties can be complicated, can't they? Your aunt was very fond of her garden. Perhaps she felt the roses would be better cared for by experts. Gerald turned to her with a forced smile. Miss Marple, isn't it? My aunt spoke of you sometimes. She said you had a habit of noticing things that weren't your business. Miss Marple smiled gently. One does notice so many small things when one has lived in the same village for a long time. For instance, I couldn't help observing that you were in the garden the afternoon your aunt died. The young man's face went still. I was only passing through. I wanted to speak to her privately, but she was busy with her precious flowers. We exchanged a few words and I left. That's all? Indeed, said Miss Marple. And did you happen to lose a button from your cuff while you were there? Gerald glanced down at his sleeve and then back at her, his expression wary. I don't know what you're talking about. Miss Marple took the tiny silver button from her bag and held it out on her palm. I found this near the rose bed where your aunt fell. It matches the ones on your jacket. For a moment, Gerald looked trapped. Then he laughed shortly. It's a coincidence. Anyone could have dropped it. The garden was full of people that day. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. But not everyone had quarreled with Miss Pinkerton over money shortly before her death. Gerald's face flushed with anger. Are you accusing me of something, old lady? Accusing? Dear me, no, said Miss Marple. I am merely trying to understand. Your aunt was a strong-willed woman. Strong-willed people sometimes make enemies without meaning to. Before Gerald could reply, Dr. Haydock appeared in the doorway. Everything all right here? Perfectly, Doctor, Miss Marple said calmly. Mr. Pinkerton and I were just discussing how unpredictable life can be. Gerald muttered something under his breath and strode out of the house, slamming the front door behind him. Dr. Haydock looked at Miss Marple with concern. "You really shouldn't provoke him, Jane. He has a quick temper." "I only asked a simple question," she replied. "But I think, Arthur, that we may need to look a little more carefully into the circumstances of Lavinia's death. A post-mortem might be wise." The doctor sighed. "I was hoping to avoid that. The family has very little family left," Miss Marple finished gently. "And the truth is more important than sparing feelings, don't you think?" Later that evening, Miss Marple sat once again in her own comfortable sitting room. The rain had stopped, and a pale moon had risen over the village. She picked up her knitting, but her hands moved slowly tonight. She thought of Gerald Pinkerton's angry face, of the missing button, and of the way Miss Pinkerton had clutched at the rose stem as she fell. Now she thought of Martha Higgs's frightened eyes and the whispered telephone conversation. "People do such strange things when they feel cornered," she said softly to the empty room. "They reach for the nearest weapon, even if that weapon is only a sharp word, or a push among the roses." She laid down her knitting and took out her notebook again. Under the heading Gerald Pinkerton, she wrote 2 words in her neat hand. Motive, opportunity. Then, after a moment's thought, she added, "But is it enough?" Outside, the church clock struck 10. In the garden of Rose Cottage, the roses continued to bloom in the moonlight, silent witnesses to whatever had happened that sunny afternoon. Miss Marple closed her notebook and sighed. "The trouble with gardens," she murmured. "Wes is that the prettiest ones so often hide the ugliest secrets." Chapter 4. Shadows in the Rose Bed. The morning after the will reading dawned bright and clear, as if the village wished to pretend that nothing unpleasant had occurred. Yet beneath the cheerful chirping of birds and the scent of fresh-cut grass, an undercurrent of unease had settled over St. Mary Mead. Doors that usually stood open were closed a little more firmly. Conversations at the post office grew hushed when newcomers approached. Miss Marple, however, went about her usual routine with outward calm. She dead-headed her own roses with careful snips of the secateurs, her thoughts far from the petals falling into her basket. The tiny silver button still rested in the pocket of her cardigan, a small, insistent reminder. At 11 o'clock she made her way once more to Rose Cottage. Martha Higgs answered the door looking more harried than ever, her apron askew and a smudge of flour on one cheek. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm glad it's you. Mr. Gerald is still here, packing some of his aunt's papers, he says. But he's in such a state, shouting down the telephone this morning about lawyers in London. It fair gives me the shivers." Miss Marple patted the housekeeper's arm. "Try not to worry, Martha. These things often sort themselves out. Might I have a word with him?" She found Gerald Pinkerton in the study, surrounded by open drawers and scattered documents. He looked up sharply as she entered, his face flushed with irritation. "What do you want now?" he demanded. "Come to accuse me again?" Miss Marple sat down uninvited in a small armchair near the window, unfolding her hands in her lap. "Dear me, no. I merely wondered whether you had found anything among your aunt's papers that might explain her sudden decision to change her will." Gerald slammed a drawer shut. She was getting senile, that's what. Always going on about her precious roses as if they were children. She even threatened to cut me out completely if I didn't settle down and stop chasing foolish schemes. As if investing in a perfectly sound aviation company was foolish. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Money can make people say harsh things. "Did your aunt mention anyone else who had displeased her lately?" The young man hesitated, then gave a short laugh. "She quarreled with half the village. Old Denham wanted a raise for all the extra work on the new rose beds. And Lettuce Fortescue kept borrowing books and never returning them. Even that artist chap who wanted to paint the garden, she practically threw him out when he suggested she might sell a few of her prize specimens." "An artist?" Miss Marple's needles had appeared in her hands as if by magic, clicking softly. "I don't believe I've met him." Name's Leonard Blake. Tall, fair-haired, rather intense. He's staying at the vicarage while he paints the church. Said he needed the garden for background or some such nonsense. Gerald shrugged. Aunt Lavinia told him the roses were not for public display. Miss Marple stored the name away carefully. And you yourself, when exactly did you arrive in the village on the day your aunt died? Gerald's eyes narrowed. Why does that matter? One likes to get the picture clear in one's mind, she replied mildly. So the garden was quite busy that afternoon. So many people coming and going. I got here around 2 o'clock, he said grudgingly. I walked through the garden to speak to her. She was pruning that blasted peace rose and barely looked up. We argued, briefly. I told her she was being unfair. She said I was ungrateful and that blood wasn't thicker than good sense. Then I left. I went back to the Blue Boar for a drink. That's all? Miss Marple's needles clicked on. And you didn't return later? No. His tone was sharp. I had no reason to. A small silence fell. From the garden came the steady snip-snip of shears. Mr. Denham was at work again, as though nothing had changed. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, Mr. Pinkerton. You have been most helpful. As she left the study, she paused in the hallway and glanced into the morning room. For on a side table lay a small leather-bound diary. Glancing quickly to make sure she was unobserved, she opened it. The last entry, dated the day before Miss Pinkerton's death, was brief and written in a firm hand. G becoming impossible. Must protect what is mine. Spoke to LB this morning, he understands. Cannot allow greed to destroy everything I have built. LB Leonard Blake? Miss Marple closed the diary softly and returned it to its place. Her heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with the quiet thrill of a pattern beginning to emerge. She stepped out into the garden. Mr. Denham was kneeling by the rose bed, carefully removing dead heads. He looked up as she approached, his lined face wary. Morning, miss. Terrible business, all this. Indeed it is, Mr. Denham. You were working here when it happened, I believe. Aye. Right over there. He pointed with his shears. She was bending down to smell the Madame Butterfly when she cried out and fell. Quick as that. Miss Marple studied the spot. Did you notice anyone else near her just before? The gardener scratched his head. Young Mr. Gerald was here earlier, arguing. Then that artist fellow came by, said he wanted another look at the light on the roses. Miss Pinkerton sent him off sharpish. After that, only Miss Lettuce reading on the grass and you ladies on the bench. Miss Marple bent down and examined the soil near where the body had lain. Something small and white caught her eye. She picked it up, a tiny scrap of paper, damp and muddied but still readable. It was part of a torn check stub. The name visible was Leonard Blake, and the amount £50. She slipped it into her pocket without comment. Mr. Denham, she said gently. Did Miss Pinkerton ever speak to you about changing her gardener? The old man's face tightened. Once or twice. Said I was getting slow. Threatened to bring in someone younger from the town. But I've looked after these roses for 20 years. They're like my own children. Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. Loyalty can be a heavy burden when it is not returned, can't it? Denham looked away, his knuckles white on the shears. She left him to his work and walked slowly towards the church. On the way she met Lettuce Fortescue coming out of the post office, her arms full of parcels. Miss Marple, I was hoping to see you. Everyone is saying the most awful things about Mr. Gerald. You don't really think he... One mustn't jump to conclusions, my dear, Miss Marple replied. But tell me, did you notice anything unusual in the garden that afternoon? Lettuce bit her lip. Well, Mr. Blake was there for a while. He seemed very interested in the roses. He even asked me if Miss Pinkerton ever sold cuttings. I told him she was terribly possessive about them. Miss Marple smiled. Young men can be very persistent when they want something. She continued on to the vicarage, where she found the artist, Leonard Blake, packing up his easel on the lawn. He was a handsome man in his late 20s with restless blue eyes and paint-stained fingers. "Miss Marple, I presume?" he said, offering a quick smile. "The famous village detective. I've heard stories." "Stories are often exaggerated," she replied pleasantly. "You were painting in the garden on the day Miss Pinkerton died?" "Only for a short while. She didn't approve of my presence. Said the roses were private." He shrugged. "Artists see beauty everywhere. I couldn't resist." Miss Marple studied his hands. There was a small scratch on the back of his right hand, fresh with a trace of dried blood. "Roses have thorns," she observed. "So they do." His smile faded slightly. "Look, if you're asking whether I had anything to do with her death, no. I barely knew the woman. I just wanted to capture the light on those flowers." Miss Marple nodded. "Light can reveal many things, Mr. Blake, sometimes more than we wish to see." As she walked home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple felt the weight of several small facts pressing upon her mind. The missing button, the torn check stub, the angry nephew, the ambitious artist, the loyal but threatened gardener, and the frightened housekeeper who had overheard a telephone call. She paused at her own garden gate and looked back towards Rose Cottage, where the roses glowed softly in the evening light. "So many people," she whispered, "with so many reasons to wish one woman gone, and yet only one of them stepped forward at the exact moment when a push would look like a fall." Inside her cottage, she added 3 new names to her notebook: Leonard Blake, artistic ambition and possible payment, Mr. Denham. Fear of losing his life's work, Lettice Fortescue. Then, with a quiet sigh, she closed the book. "The garden looks so peaceful from a distance," she said to her cat, who blinked sleepily from the windowsill. "But step closer, and you see the thorns. And sometimes, my dear, the deadliest thorn is the one hidden behind a smiling face." The church clock struck 6. In the village of St. Mary Mead, the shadows in the rose bed were growing longer, and Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty born of long observation of human nature, that the truth was buried somewhere among those beautiful, treacherous flowers. Chapter 5. Tea and Suspicions. The following afternoon found Miss Marple hosting a small tea party in her own neat sitting room. It was not an unusual occurrence. Miss Marple enjoyed bringing people together over cucumber sandwiches and seed cake. But today, the gathering had a definite purpose. Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, had all accepted her invitation with alacrity. Even young Lettice Fortescue had been persuaded to come, though she arrived looking rather nervous, and the French windows stood open to the garden, letting in the scent of roses and the gentle hum of bees. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual graceful efficiency, her blue eyes moving quietly from face to face. "Such a sad business," Mrs. Bantry declared, accepting a slice of cake. "The whole village is talking of nothing else. Have you heard that Gerald Pinkerton has been seen arguing with the solicitor again? He swears he'll contest the will." Dr. Haydock stirred sugar into his tea with unnecessary vigor. "Contesting won't do him much good if the doctors confirm natural causes. I still maintain it was her heart." Miss Marple passed him a plate of sandwiches. "And yet, Arthur, you did agree to consider a post-mortem, did you not?" The doctor sighed. "Reluctantly. The authorities are looking into it now. But I warn you, Jane, so as if nothing suspicious turns up, this village gossip could do real harm." Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "I heard from the butcher's wife that Miss Pinkerton had been receiving anonymous letters. Threatening ones. Something about knowing too much and paying the price." Lettice Fortescue's teacup rattled in its saucer. "Anonymous letters? That sounds dreadful. Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked on her shawl. "People write such things when they feel desperate, my dear, or when they have something to hide. Did any of you notice anything unusual in Miss Pinkerton's manners during the weeks before her death?" There was a thoughtful silence. Then Mrs. Bantry spoke. She did seem rather sharp with everyone. More than usual. She snapped at poor Nurse Denham twice in 1 week about the weeding, and she told me quite firmly that she was tired of people expecting things from her simply because she had money. Dr. Haydock set his cup down. She consulted me about her heart only 10 days ago, complained of palpitations and shortness of breath. I prescribed rest and less excitement. She laughed and said excitement was the only thing keeping her alive. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did she mention any particular source of that excitement? Not directly. But she did say something about settling old scores before it was too late. I thought it was just her usual dramatic way of speaking. Lettuce twisted her hands in her lap. I feel awful now. I borrowed her copy of The Secret Garden the week before and never returned it. She was cross when I saw her in the garden that day. She said young people had no respect for property anymore. Miss Marple smiled kindly at the girl. We all have small regrets after someone passes, dear. But tell me, did you see Mr. Leonard Blake speaking with Miss Pinkerton that afternoon? Lettuce nodded. Yes, briefly. He was very charming at first, complimenting her roses. Then he asked if she would consider letting him exhibit one of her prize specimens at the county show. She refused quite rudely and told him to leave the garden at once. Mrs. Bantry raised her eyebrows. An artist asking for favors? How forward. Artists can be very determined, Miss Marple observed, especially when they see something they believe could advance their career. The conversation turned to other village matters, but Miss Marple's mind remained fixed on the garden. After her guests had gone, she put on her gardening gloves and walked across to Rose Cottage once more. The police had finished their preliminary examination, and the garden was quiet except for the distant sound of Mr. Denham raking leaves. She found Martha Higgs in the kitchen, polishing silver with tearful concentration. Martha, dear, you must be exhausted. Has anyone been troubling you? The housekeeper wiped her eyes. Mr. Gerald keeps asking about papers and keys, and that artist came again this morning wanting to finish his sketch. I told him the mistress wouldn't have liked it, but he was very persuasive. Said the light was perfect today. Miss Marple's interest quickened. Did he go into the garden? Yes, miss. He spent nearly an hour near the rose bed where it happened. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside. She moved softly along the gravel path until she reached the spot. The soil had been disturbed slightly, more than one might expect from simple police examination. Kneeling with some difficulty, she noticed a small depression in the earth, as though someone had pressed a heel down hard. Rising, she brushed the soil from her gloves and continued her circuit of the garden. Near the back hedge, half hidden by a clump of lavender, she found a crumpled cigarette packet. It was an expensive brand, not the sort Mr. Denham would smoke. She slipped it into her pocket beside the torn check stub. As she turned to leave, she almost collided with Leonard Blake, who was coming round the corner with his sketchbook under his arm. Miss Marple. He recovered quickly, flashing a charming smile. You startled me. Beautiful garden, isn't it? Ah, even in sadness it holds such color. It does, she agreed. Roses have a way of blooming regardless of human troubles. Did you find the light satisfactory today, Mr. Blake? He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Quite satisfactory, though the police tape made composition difficult. Miss Marple tilted her head. You seem very drawn to this particular garden. Was there something specific you hoped to capture? Blake's smile faltered. An artist paints what moves him, those hybrid teas, especially the peace rose. She had specimens that were almost perfect. I hoped she might lend me one for a still life. She refused, of course. And yet you returned after her death, Miss Marple said gently. The young man's face hardened. Is that an accusation? Merely an observation, she replied. One notices when people return to the scene of a tragedy. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is something else. Blake closed his sketchbook with a snap. I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. Miss Pinkerton was difficult, but I admired her knowledge of roses. That is all. He strode away towards the gate, his shoulders stiff with irritation. Miss Marple watched him go, then made her way home through the lengthening shadows. Once inside, she spread her small collection of finds on the table. The silver button, the torn check stub made out to Leonard Blake, the expensive cigarette packet, and a tiny scrap of lavender-colored thread she had noticed caught on a rose thorn earlier. She sat down with her notebook and wrote steadily. Leonard Blake wanted rose specimens or cuttings for his work. A possible financial arrangement with Miss Pinkerton. Check suggests payment or bribe. Returned to garden after death. Why? Gerald Pinkerton, angry about will, missing button matches, quick temper, Mr. Denham, threatened with replacement, deep attachment to garden. Martha Higgs, overheard angry telephone call, long service, possible resentment over meager bequest. She tapped her pencil against the page. Human nature was so predictable in its unpredictability. Greed, fear, pride, jealousy, all could push a person to a desperate act. And in a quiet village garden on a sunny afternoon, a single push or a handful of crushed petals could look exactly like a heart attack. That evening, as she sat by the fire with a cup of cocoa, the telephone rang. It was Dr. Haydock. Jane, the post-mortem results are in. The preliminary findings show digitalis in her system, far more than she was prescribed for her heart. Not enough to kill outright in most cases, but combined with her condition, it could have caused fatal arrhythmia. Someone gave her an extra dose. Miss Marple's hand tightened on the receiver. Administered how, Arthur? Likely in a drink or food shortly before she collapsed. The timing fits the garden incident perfectly. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then it was not natural causes after all. No, the doctor said heavily. It was murder, Jane, carefully planned to look like nature taking its course among the roses. Miss Marple thanked him quietly and hung up. She returned to her chair, but her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. Poor Lavinia, she whispered. You thought your garden was your sanctuary. Instead, and it became the perfect stage for someone who knew your habits, your weaknesses, and the very flowers you loved. Outside, the village slept peacefully under a starlit sky, but in Miss Marple's mind, the pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a clear and troubling picture. Someone in St. Mary Mead had watched Miss Pinkerton among her roses, had waited for the right moment, and had ensured that her final afternoon in the garden would be her last. And Miss Marple, with her sharp knitting needles and even sharper understanding of human nature, was determined to discover exactly who had planted that deadly seed. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Petals. The news that Miss Lavinia Pinkerton's death was no longer considered natural spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire carried on a summer breeze. By mid-morning the following day, as the village seemed to hold its breath, shopkeepers spoke in lowered voices, mothers kept their children closer to home, and even the birds in the churchyard appeared to sing more cautiously. Miss Marple sat in her garden with a basket of mending on her lap, outwardly serene. Inside, however, her mind moved with the precision of a well-oiled clock. Digitalis. The word kept returning to her. A heart medicine, easily obtained, deadly in the wrong dose. Someone had known Miss Pinkerton's weak heart and had used that knowledge with cold calculation. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after 11, looking grave. He accepted a cup of coffee and sat heavily in the wicker chair opposite her. Official confirmation came this morning, he said. Traces of digitalis leaves crushed into a strong infusion, likely mixed with her usual herbal tea. She always carried a small thermos when gardening. The poison would have taken effect within 20 to 30 minutes. Enough time for her to feel dizzy, clutch at her chest, and collapse among the roses. A perfect murder, Jane. It looked exactly like the heart failure I had warned her about. Miss Marple's needles paused. Who had access to her thermos? Anyone in the garden that afternoon. Martha filled it for her every morning. Mr. Denham often brought her fresh tea when she worked late. Gerald visited. Blake was there. Even lettuce could have slipped something in while no one was looking. The doctor rubbed his forehead. The police are questioning everyone now, but they have no clear suspect. Too many people, too little proof. Miss Marple poured him another cup. Proof is often found in small things, Arthur. Tell me, did the laboratory find anything else unusual? Only that the dose was cleverly calculated. Not enough to cause immediate convulsions that might have drawn attention, but sufficient to stop a weakened heart. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. After the doctor left, Miss Marple decided it was time for a more direct approach. She walked to Rose Cottage, where Inspector Slack from the Milchester Police had set up a temporary headquarters in the morning room. The inspector was a brisk, no-nonsense man who had crossed paths with Miss Marple before and regarded her with a mixture of respect and irritation. Miss Marple, he greeted her curtly. I suppose you've come to offer your famous village insights? She smiled sweetly. Only if they might be useful, Inspector. I understand the poison was digitalis. Foxglove grows wild in many hedgerows, but crushing the leaves properly requires knowledge. Slack nodded grudgingly. We're checking gardens. Mr. Denham has foxgloves at the back of the churchyard plot he tends. Blake claims he uses them in some of his paintings for color studies. Gerald Pinkerton says he knows nothing about plants. Miss Marple sat down without being asked. And Martha Higgs, the housekeeper. She prepared the thermos, but she seems genuinely devastated. Says Miss Pinkerton was like a mother to her, though a strict one. Miss Marple took out the small items she had collected. The silver button, the check stub, the cigarette packet, and the lavender thread. I found these in or near the rose bed, she said quietly. The button matches Gerald's jacket. The check stub is made out to Leonard Blake for £50. As the cigarette packet is an expensive Turkish brand, Mr. Blake smokes them. The thread is the same color as the scarf Miss Pinkerton sometimes wore when gardening. Inspector Slack examined each item carefully. You've been busy. Any conclusions? Only that several people had both motive and opportunity, Miss Marple replied. Gerald was angry about the will and had quarrelled with his aunt that very day. Leonard Blake wanted something from the garden, perhaps rare cuttings or the right to paint them for an important exhibition. Mr. Denham feared losing his position after 20 years of devoted service. Even Martha might have felt bitter about her small legacy after years of loyal service. Slack leaned back. Motive is one thing. Proving who actually administered the poison is another. No one admits to touching the thermos after Martha filled it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps someone did not need to touch it directly. A few crushed leaves sprinkled into the cup while Miss Pinkerton was distracted by her flowers. Or added earlier and allowed to steep. She rose to leave, then paused at the door. Inspector, has anyone mentioned the telephone call Martha overheard 2 nights before the death? Miss Pinkerton sounded very angry. Something about not standing for it any longer and knowing what someone had been doing. Slack made a note. We'll look into it. Thank you, Miss Marple. Your observations are useful, as always. Outside, Miss Marple found Mr. Denham working near the hedge. His face was drawn, and his hands trembled slightly as he clipped the yew. Terrible thing. Oh, this poison business, he muttered when she greeted him. Police have been asking me about foxgloves, as if I'd harm the mistress after all these years. She could be sharp, but she loved these roses as much as I did. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. Loyalty is a fine thing, Mr. Denham, but sometimes loyalty is tested when one fears losing everything one cares for. The old gardener's eyes filled with sudden tears. She talked of bringing in a younger man, said my hands were getting stiff. These roses are all I have, miss. Without them, what am I?" Miss Marple patted his arm gently. "We all fear being replaced, don't we? But murder is a heavy price to pay for pride." She left him and continued to the vicarage, where she found Leonard Blake packing his belongings with quick, angry movements. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Blake?" she asked. He turned, his handsome face flushed. "The atmosphere here has become unbearable. Everyone looks at me as though I'm a criminal because I admired those roses. Yes, I asked Miss Pinkerton for cuttings and offered to pay £50 for the privilege of painting them properly. She laughed in my face and accused me of trying to steal her secrets. But I didn't kill her." Miss Marple studied him. "And the check stub I found near the rosebed." Blake's shoulders slumped. "She tore it up in front of me that afternoon and threw the pieces down. Said money couldn't buy what she had spent a lifetime cultivating. I was furious, but I walked away. I swear it." "Anger can make people do foolish things," Miss Marple said softly. "But sometimes it leads to worse." As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Gerald Pinkerton. She found him at the Blue Boar, nursing a whiskey in the quiet lounge. He looked up warily as she approached. "Come to gloat, Miss Marple? The police have questioned me for 2 hours. They think I poisoned my own aunt for a house I didn't even inherit." Miss Marple sat opposite him. "Did you, Mr. Pinkerton?" He stared at her, then gave a bitter laugh. "No, I was angry. Yes, she humiliated me in front of the family solicitor. But I wouldn't kill her, not like that, not among her precious flowers." Miss Marple noticed that his cuff still lacked the silver button. "Where were you between 2:30 and 3 o'clock that afternoon?" "I told the police. I went for a walk along the river path to cool my temper. No one saw me. Convenient, isn't it?" "Very convenient," Miss Marple agreed. "Or very unfortunate." That evening, and as the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat once more by her fireside. She had added several new lines to her notebook. Digitalis, easily obtained from garden plants. Knowledge of Miss Pinkerton's heart condition essential. Thermos, point of delivery. Who had closest access without suspicion? The torn check, anger or payment refused. Telephone call. Who was on the other end? She closed the book and stared into the flames. "Someone moved quietly among the roses that day," she murmured. "Someone who knew that a little poison, a little timing, and a great deal of resentment could turn a beautiful afternoon into tragedy." Her cat jumped onto her lap, purring. Miss Marple stroked its fur absently. "The difficulty, my dear, is that in a village everyone knows everyone's habits, and the murderer counted on that familiarity to hide their crime. But familiarity is a double-edged sword. It also allows one to notice when something is just slightly out of place." Outside, the roses in gardens across St. Mary Mead closed their petals for the night, but the poison that had bloomed in one of them still cast its shadow. Miss Marple smiled a small, determined smile. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I think it is time to have a serious talk with Martha Higgs. Housekeepers see more than most people realize, and sometimes what they see can unravel even the most carefully planted garden of lies." Chapter 7. The Housekeeper's Secret. The next morning brought a soft mist that hung over St. Mary Mead like a veil, softening the edges of cottages and muting the usual cheerful sounds of village life. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and after a light breakfast of tea and toast, she set out once more for Rose Cottage. This time her purpose was clear, a quiet conversation with Martha Higgs, away from the police and the prying eyes of the village. Martha answered the door, looking pale and exhausted, her usual neat apron replaced by a crumpled one stained with tea leaves. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The police were here again last night, asking the same questions over and over. I don't know how much more I can bear." Miss Marple stepped inside and took the housekeeper's cold hands in her own. My dear Martha, you have carried a heavy burden these many years. Come, let us sit in the kitchen where it is warm. A cup of tea will do us both good." In the familiar kitchen, and with its scrubbed pine table and the faint scent of baking that still lingered from happier days, Miss Marple prepared the tea herself. She moved with deliberate calmness, giving Martha time to compose herself. When the two women were seated with steaming cups before them, Miss Marple spoke gently. "Martha, you were closer to Miss Pinkerton than anyone else in the village. You knew her habits, her moods, her little kindnesses, and her sharp words. If anyone can help bring peace to this unhappy business, it is you." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "She could be difficult, miss, very difficult, but she was fair in her own way. 15 years I served her, through good times and bad. And now, to think someone deliberately harmed her among her own roses. It breaks my heart." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. The poison was digitalous, added to her thermos of herbal tea. "You prepared that thermos every morning, didn't you?" "Yes, miss. Just as she liked it. Weak, with a slice of lemon and a few mint leaves from the garden. I never touched anything else. I swear it on my mother's grave." "I believe you," Miss Marple said softly, "but someone else may have had access to it later. Tell me about the afternoon she died. What happened after you filled the thermos?" Martha wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. "I took it out to her in the garden around 1:30. She was already among the roses, humming to herself as she often did when she was happy with her flowers. She thanked me and said she would be working until tea time. Then Mr. Gerald arrived. I heard raised voices from the study window, something about the will and ungrateful nephews. Then he stormed out through the garden gate shortly after. Miss Marple's knitting had appeared in her hands, the steady click-click providing a soothing rhythm. And after Mr. Gerald left, Miss Lettice came by to return a book. She stayed only a few minutes. Then that artist, Mr. Blake, appeared at the gate. Miss Pinkerton sent him away quite sharply. I was in the kitchen washing up when I heard her cry out. By the time I reached the garden, she was already on the ground among the roses." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Martha, 2 nights before her death, you overheard a telephone conversation." Miss Pinkerton sounded angry. "Can you remember the exact words?" The housekeeper hesitated, twisting her hands. "I shouldn't have listened, but the door was ajar. She said, 'I know what you've been doing, and I won't stand for it any longer. As if you think you can take what is mine, you're very much mistaken.' Then she slammed the receiver down. When I asked if everything was all right, she told me it was none of my business and to bring her a glass of sherry." Miss Marple's eyes were bright with interest. "Did she mention any name?" "No, miss, but she was white with anger. Later that evening she sat writing letters, several of them. She burned one in the fireplace. I saw the ashes the next morning." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Did Miss Pinkerton keep a second set of keys to the garden shed? The one where the gardening tools and sprays are stored?" Martha nodded. "Yes, she kept a spare set in the top drawer of her desk. She was particular about the shed because that's where she stored her special rose fertilizers and some of the stronger plant treatments." A small silence fell. Miss Marple allowed it to lengthen, watching Martha's face. Finally she asked, very gently, "Martha, my dear, is there something you're afraid to tell me? Something that has been weighing on your conscience?" The housekeeper burst into tears. "Oh, Miss Marple, I've been so frightened. 2 weeks ago, Miss Pinkerton told me she was thinking of retiring me when she changed her will. Said I was getting slow and that a younger woman might manage better. I was hurt, terribly hurt. I had given her the best years of my life. But I swear I never harmed her. I only took a small silver teaspoon from the drawing room, a silly keepsake, nothing more. And I was angry and frightened about my future. But poison, never." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "We all have moments of weakness when we feel cornered, Martha. The important thing is that you did not kill her. But tell me, did anyone else know about the spare keys to the shed?" Mr. Denham knew, of course, and Mr. Gerald had asked about them once when he wanted to look for some old family papers. Miss Pinkerton refused. As for Mr. Blake, I don't think so, but he was very interested in the garden. He asked me once what sprays she used for black spot. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, looking out at the rose bed where the tragedy had occurred. The flowers still bloomed bravely, unaware of the darkness that had touched them. "Martha," she said at last, I believe the murderer is someone who knew Miss Pinkerton's routines intimately. Someone who could approach the thermos without arousing suspicion. Someone who understood that a little extra digitalis, disguised as her usual medicine, would look like natural causes. She turned back to the housekeeper. "Did Miss Pinkerton ever mention being afraid of anyone?" Martha shook her head. "Not afraid exactly. But she did say once that blood was not always thicker than water, and that some people smiled while they sharpened their knives." Miss Marple thanked Martha warmly and left the cottage with a heavy heart, but a clearer mind. As she walked slowly home through the misty lanes, she met Inspector Slack coming the other way. "Any progress, Inspector?" she asked. Slack grunted. "We've traced the digitalis. New leaves were taken from the wild patch behind the churchyard, Denham's territory, but anyone could have picked them. The check stub you found was indeed made out by Miss Pinkerton to Blake, but she tore it up. He admits they quarreled about money for his painting." Miss Marple nodded. "And the telephone call?" "We're still checking the exchange records. It may take time." Miss Marple smiled her sweet, vague smile. "Time is something we may not have much of, Inspector. The murderer must be feeling the net tightening. People in that state sometimes make mistakes." She continued on her way, stopping briefly at the churchyard to examine the patch of foxgloves growing wild near the wall. The leaves showed signs of recent picking, several stems broken unevenly. From there she went to the Blue Boar, where she found Gerald Pinkerton sitting alone in the lounge, staring into an untouched glass of beer. "Mr. Pinkerton," she said, taking the seat opposite him without invitation, "I've just come from Rose Cottage. Martha is quite distraught. She told me about your aunt's threat to replace her." Gerald looked up sharply. Aunt Lavinia threatened everyone when she was in a temper. It didn't mean anything. "Perhaps not to you," Miss Marple replied gently, "but to a woman who had devoted her life to service, it meant a great deal. Tell me honestly, did you return to the garden after your quarrel that afternoon?" Gerald's face paled. I walked past the gate again around 3 o'clock. I wanted to apologize. But when I looked in, she was already on the ground and people were running towards her. I panicked and left. I know how it looks. But I swear I didn't poison her." Miss Marple studied his troubled face. There was fear there, and genuine regret. "Fear makes us do strange things, Mr. Pinkerton, but hiding the truth only makes the shadows darker." She left him and walked the short distance to her own cottage, where she sat down at her writing desk and opened her notebook once more. She wrote steadily for some time, listing times, movements, and small inconsistencies. When she finally closed the book, the mist had lifted and sunlight was breaking through. The village looked peaceful again, but Miss Marple knew better. "The pieces are nearly in place," she murmured to herself. "One more conversation, one more small observation, and the picture will be complete. The murderer thought the roses would hide their crime. But roses have eyes, thousands of tiny eyes in every petal, and they have already told their story to those who know how to listen." She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking with renewed purpose. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I shall invite a few people to tea again. This time the conversation will be quite different, and someone, I think, will find the taste of truth rather bitter." Outside, the roses in the village gardens nodded in the breeze, their beauty undimmed. But in one garden, the shadow of murder still lingered, waiting for Miss Marple's quiet, relentless mind to bring it into the light. Chapter 8. The Truth Among the Roses. The invitation to tea at Miss Marple's cottage on the following afternoon was accepted by everyone with varying degrees of reluctance and curiosity. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, eye full of lively anticipation. Dr. Haydock came next, looking professionally grave. Inspector Slack followed, his notebook already in hand. Gerald Pinkerton appeared pale and tense, Leonard Blake with defensive bravado, Mr. Denham twisting his cap nervously, Lettice Fortescue wide-eyed and silent, and finally Martha Higgs, who sat on the edge of her chair, as though ready to flee at any moment. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual serene efficiency, the click of china cups providing a deceptively peaceful background. Sunlight streamed through the French windows, illuminating the bowl of fresh roses she had cut from her own garden that morning. "Thank you all for coming," she began in her gentle, old-fashioned voice. "Tragedy has touched our quiet village, and I believe the time has come to speak plainly. And Miss Pinkerton died not of a simple heart attack, but of digitalis poisoning cleverly administered in her thermos of herbal tea. The murderer knew her habits, her weak heart, and chose the perfect setting, her beloved rose garden, where any collapse would appear natural." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Gerald's hands clenched on his knees. Blake shifted uneasily. Mr. Denham stared at the floor. Miss Marple continued calmly, her knitting needles beginning their steady rhythm. "Several of you had motives. Mr. Gerald quarrelled bitterly with his aunt over money and the will. Mr. Blake wanted access to her prize roses for his art and was refused. Mr. Denham feared replacement after years of devoted service. Martha worried about her future when Miss Pinkerton spoke of retiring her. And even small jealousies and resentments played their part. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "With respect, Miss Marple, we need proof, not speculation. Proof is often found in small, overlooked things," she replied sweetly. "Let us begin with the silver button I found near the rosebed. It matches the ones on Mr. Gerald's jacket. He admits he was in the garden that afternoon." Gerald started to protest, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. "You returned later, did you not? You wanted to apologize, but when you saw her on the ground, fear made you run. That was foolish, but it does not make you a murderer." She turned to Leonard Blake. "You received a check for £50, which Miss Pinkerton tore up in anger. You were seen near the rosebed. Can you smoke the expensive Turkish cigarettes whose packet I found crushed among the lavender? You hoped her death might allow you greater freedom to paint or even acquire cuttings. But ambition alone does not prove guilt." Blake opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face flushed. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Mr. Denham. "You knew the garden better than anyone. Foxglove leaves were taken from the patch you tend. You were afraid of losing your life's work, yet your hands tremble when you speak of her, and your grief seems genuine. A man who truly loved those roses would not destroy the gardener who created them." The old man nodded mutely, tears in his eyes. "Martha," Miss Marple said kindly, "you prepared the thermos, and you were hurt by talk of replacement. But your devotion was real. The small silver teaspoon you took in a moment of resentment is a minor thing. It does not make you a poisoner." Martha covered her face and wept quietly. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at the group with quiet compassion. The murderer was someone who could approach the thermos without suspicion, someone who knew exactly how much digitalis would tip Miss Pinkerton's weak heart into failure without causing dramatic symptoms that might alert others immediately. Someone who counted on the confusion of the moment in the garden to hide their action. She paused, letting the silence grow heavy. Then she continued softly. The key lay in the telephone call Martha overheard. Miss Pinkerton said, "I know what you've been doing and I won't stand for it any longer." She was not speaking to her nephew about money, nor to Mr. Blake about paintings, nor to Mr. Denham about gardening. She was speaking to someone much closer, someone she had trusted for years. All eyes turned involuntarily toward Martha, But Miss Marple shook her head. No, not Martha. The person on the other end of that line was someone Miss Pinkerton had known since childhood, someone who visited the garden often under the guise of friendship, someone who had been systematically taking small amounts of money from Miss Pinkerton's accounts over the past year. Money she finally discovered when checking her bank statements 2 weeks before her death. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost regretful. "Lettuce, my dear." The young woman gave a violent start. Her face drained of color. "Me? That's absurd. Oh, I barely knew her." "You knew her well enough to borrow books and visit the garden," Miss Marple said sadly. "You knew her routines. You knew she carried that thermos everywhere when gardening. And you knew about digitalis because your own grandmother took it for her heart. You mentioned it once when speaking to Mrs. Bantry. You had access to the spare keys in the desk drawer. You picked the foxglove leaves from the churchyard the night before, crushed them carefully, and sprinkled them into the thermos when you returned the book that afternoon. While Miss Pinkerton was distracted, scolding Mr. Denham about the Madame Butterfly rose, you added the poison. Then you sat on the grass, reading, waiting for the effect. Lettuce jumped to her feet, her voice rising shrilly. "You can't prove any of this. It's all guesses. An old woman's fantasies." Inspector Slack stood up, his expression stern. "Miss Fortescue, I must ask you to come with me to the station." "But why?" Lettuce cried, tears streaming down her face. "She was going to change her will again. She told me so. She said she might leave something to me if I helped her catalogue her rose collection properly. Then suddenly she decided to give everything to the Horticultural Society. It wasn't fair. I needed the money. For my future, for my mother's debts. She had so much and gave so little." The room fell silent except for Lettuce's sobbing. Mrs. Bantry looked shocked. Dr. Haydock shook his head sadly. Miss Marple spoke with quiet sorrow. "Human nature is very frail, my dear. Jealousy and greed can grow like weeds, even in the most beautiful garden. You thought a quiet push of poison among the roses would solve everything. But evil, once planted, always leaves traces. The missing button that fell when Gerald argued earlier, the torn check that had nothing to do with the crime, the cigarette packet dropped by Mr. Blake in his frustration. All of them distracted us nicely. But the real clue was the lavender thread from your scarf caught on a rose thorn exactly where you stood when you added the poison to the cup." Lettuce collapsed back into her chair, covering her face. "I didn't mean for her to die. I only wanted to make her ill so she would change her mind." Inspector Slack placed a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. "That will be for the court to decide, miss." As the inspector led Lettuce away, the remaining guests sat in stunned silence. Gerald Pinkerton looked shaken but relieved. "I thought it was me they suspected." "We all thought many things," Miss Marple said softly. "That is the tragedy of suspicion. It blinds us to the quietest dangers." Dr. Haydock rose and patted her shoulder. "Well done, Jane. Once again, you've seen what the rest of us missed." Mrs. Bantry shook her head in wonder. Among the roses, of all places. How dreadful. Miss Marple looked out at her own garden, where the evening light was turning the flowers to gold. "Gardens teach us many lessons," she said. "Beauty can hide danger, and the most carefully tended plot can still produce weeds. But truth, like a good gardener, eventually clears the ground and lets the light reach the flowers again." Later that evening, after the last visitor had gone, Miss Marple sat alone by her fireside. The church clock struck 9, its chimes floating peacefully over the village. She picked up her knitting once more, the cream shawl nearly finished now. "Poor Lettuce," she murmured. "She wanted so much and understood so little. Miss Pinkerton loved her roses more than people, perhaps. And in the end, that love cost her life." Her cat jumped into her lap, purring contentedly. Miss Marple stroked its fur with gentle fingers. "Still," she said with a small, wise smile, "St. Mary Mead will recover." Gardens bloom again after even the harshest winter, and we who live among them must remember to watch not only for beauty, but for the roots that grow beneath. Outside, in the tranquil English village, the roses continued to bloom in the soft night air. Beautiful, thorny, on and eternal witnesses to the small dramas and quiet triumphs of human hearts. And Miss Marple, with her sharp mind and kind heart, continued her knitting, content that once again order had been restored among the flowers of St. Mary Mead.